Hi, everyone, and welcome to Solving Climate Change Once and for All. I'm Bihuye, and thank you so much for joining this online series where we're talking to experts and entrepreneurs to learn what, from their work, we can apply to climate action and, more importantly, to climate justice. You'll leave with the number one thing you can do to make a positive impact. Today, we're very lucky to be joined by an important creative voice, Marcela Teran. She's the founder of Liberation Works, and her personal story about how she navigated her path to creating a positive impact is one that really resonated with me, and I'm sure will resonate with many of you as well. Thank you so much for joining us, Marcela.
Thank you for having me.
So let's go back to the roots of your career. I would love if you could share a little bit more about the day you started your work in design and kind of what that tipping point was for you in taking the leap of faith to start Liberation Works.
Sure. So I studied graphic design in Venezuela, where I'm from. But there's a funny story from even before I started studying, which I thought could be nice to share, which is that when I was waiting to start university, my mom had a friend who had a creative agency, and my mom got me a position there as a basically shadow of someone. It was meant to last for I think a month or so, but I didn't even last a week. I didn't even last 2 days. I went there, and on my first day, I was assigned to shadow this person, and then realized that the main client from this agency was a really famous beer company in Venezuela, which I would say is infamous for its ads, which are portraying basically almost naked woman whose face you can never see. And I was there sitting next to a guy as he was like staring at this really objectifying picture of a woman. And it was just really, really uncomfortable. I was, really put off by it. And then when I arrived home, I told my mom, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be sitting next to a guy, watching him watch a woman's boobs like, for the entire day. And she was very understanding. I mean, I didn't have the language of feminism then, but there was something that didn't sit right with me. Like, this is not what I wanted to spend my time doing. I didn't think that that's what I wanted to spend my life doing. So yeah, that didn't go very well. But I think what's interesting is that that same feeling that I had then, that feeling of like, I can't do this with my life, is something that I then experienced again when I finished university and I started working for a small ad agency. And then again was faced with this prospect of having to be designing signs for places that I wouldn't go to, or designing adverts for products that I wouldn't want to buy, and then just questioning like, what is the purpose of this profession that I've decided to study, and really doubting whether this was something that I could dedicate my life to, and still have values. So I was compelled to also not continue working for that other ad agency, and many things happened, and I decided to study a master's in design and environment, and then that led me to come to London and start looking for ways to apply my skills to things that I care about. And Liberation Works is the product of, I suppose, more than 10 years of searching for that, and then deciding actually what I want is to do something that I can have autonomy over, and that can strive to be a reflection of the person that I am and the values that I have and the things I care about, and contribute to that.
That's an amazing story. I think just to think about how much courage you had at an early stage of your career to identify what you didn't see align with your values and then act on it to then find your path towards something that was truly meaningful and that you saw could make an impact on those around you positively. So thanks so much for sharing that. I think that point you make also about not having the language or vocabulary of feminism at the time is really important, because we know that words matter, and without the right vernacular, you can't even convey right at the time. You knew something was wrong about objectifying women, but you couldn't necessarily say exactly what was wrong about that in the position that you find yourself in. And so I'm curious, for as we're developing language around social justice now, and particularly climate justice in your line of work for liberation works, how do you define that climate justice, and why do you think it's so often overlooked?
Yeah, good question. I think people define climate justice in different ways. For me, it means recognizing that those who are most heavily impacted by climate change and environmental destruction are those who have done the least to cause them. That's the starting point. But it also means working to dismantle the structures that allow for some people to pay the price for other people's lifestyles. It means also taking leadership from people who are on the front lines, who have been calling for systemic change for such a long time, and who have been resisting all of the struggles that are interconnected, struggles of colonialism, patriarchy, imperialism, extractivism for such a long time. And they have been leading, and often, in the West especially, they have been ignored, and their cries have been ignored, and their action has been ignored. So it means really looking at what's happening and taking leadership there, not just trying to come up with all of the answers in isolation. And it also, for me, very importantly, means recognizing that tackling climate change is a lot more than just keeping emissions down. And it's about crafting a completely different economy that supports people and the planet to flourish.
Absolutely. And I think that that human aspect that you're bringing to your lens of defining climate justice is so important, and certainly comes through your values and mission for the work that you want to do. Earlier you mentioned, questioning those values and sort of figuring out what are those and what is my sense of purpose, which I think resonates with everyone at any point in their career as they go through their journey, to have that be their North Star. I think something else that kind of comes up in this line of work when you're facing such global, systemic, widespread crisis like the climate crisis is, am I doing enough? How did you reconcile that for yourself between taking that exploratory path and then landing where you are now?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And it's one that I am still grappling with. I am constantly asking that myself. Am I doing enough? And I know everyone that I know that is working towards change is constantly asking themselves this. And perhaps it's a good question to ask anyway during your life. But yeah, for me, it has been a process of trying to work on myself and trying to work on what is important to me, and trying to unpack this question of enough. One of the things that people who I admire say is also what is our benchmark for enough, and who is defining that. And obviously, if you are a woman, or if you're a person of color, or if you're a person from a migrant background, then also the benchmark that you're using is I have to prove myself, or that's what I often feel like. I have to prove myself, prove my worth. I have to, there's this imposter syndrome, like that means that you have to go even further. And I think it is important to be considering where is this feeling coming from of not doing enough. So also particularly for me, one of the questions that I've always had is around like being a creative, being a designer, and is this a helpful thing to be doing? Like, you know, often it's belittled as you're just making things pretty, and that stays in your head as, oh, is this all that my profession can do? But it has been I think a really valuable journey and quest for me to be considering these questions. And I've had a coach for almost a year now, has been super helpful, and she introduced us, Cynthia. And this is one of the things that we have really been working on in terms of me going around this circle constantly of like, oh, maybe I should be doing other things. Maybe I should have gone into biology or whatever, all of these other professions that perhaps are more useful. And then coming back to actually, no, why am I doubting this? I have a skill, I have a gift, and the most genuine thing that I can do is put that to the service of the things that I care about. And it's something I can offer that is authentic to myself. So I think that this question of authenticity has come up for me as perhaps a more useful question, or a different reframing of the question of, am I enough? And it's more about, instead of it, am I doing enough to satisfy something external? Is it, am I doing enough to be really authentically myself and offer what I can offer? Which is something that then, yeah, it's not something that I'm gonna be able to answer in terms of external, I don't know, a badge or something. It's more something that I can find in myself. If it feels good to me, if it feels like I am being authentically myself, then if it means that if I am being an honest representation of who I aspire to be, then perhaps that is enough. But yeah, it's definitely a question that I keep in my head all of the time, and it always comes up in my conversations with my friends who are asking themselves the same thing, and we all think that everyone's doing amazing things. So how can you be thinking that you're not enough if you're like fantastic? So I think it is something that we are all struggling with, and it's normal to be struggling with it. But I think finding new ways of reframing it that are helpful for you is something that I would recommend.
That is so helpful and meaningful to hear. Thanks for sharing that experience. It certainly resonates with me, and I'm sure in your experience, you know, immigrating from Venezuela, now living in London, those external benchmarks and what you're seeking in terms of validation, it is hard to not strive sometimes for what society is telling you you might need to do or achieve in a certain way, but then going back to your original sort of North Star. What are my values, and what is the specific gift that I can give at that intersection to make an impact on the things that I care about, right? That reframe is so powerful. And I love that as a tool to constantly ask yourself this question, but to go back to, well, if I am using my specific skill set to make that impact on the things that I care about and those causes, yes, it is enough. And you are doing so much amazing work on behalf of the environment and the climate through creative that is awesome to see. So you are enough. Thank you for all you're doing.
Thank you. That's really sweet.
So one interesting parallel I wanted to talk about between art and creative design, graphics, and climate change is that they are both sometimes nebulous ideas that we're dealing with, right? They're hard to visualize. Sometimes they're presented in confusing ways with lots of different opinions that are muddling up kind of the core of what we're trying to communicate. I'm curious what you've seen be effective in your art and illustration and graphic design work to effectively communicate, engage, even inspire folks, which is something that we really need to do around climate justice.
Yes, so I agree. There are parallels between those. I suppose one of the things that I always start with is questioning. So if you get a brief, the first thing for me is break it apart and try and dissect it and try and go really, really deep into each and every part. And I think that's, in comparison with an issue as huge as climate change, because it's so massive, it feels like, what? How am I going to work with this thing? So breaking it apart and trying to understand it, I think is the first thing for me that I think is really useful and important, an important starting point. Another principle that I think I apply and that I find to be a good frame to approach problems with is around maybe not necessarily trying to find the one answer, but trying to expand the repertoire of possibilities for people to engage with a certain situation or a certain problem. So with climate change, again, maybe there's one solution, but if we are breaking it apart and then showing different ways, different entry points, different angles, then perhaps that can then lead to more answers or more questions, and those are useful too. And the other aspect around the repertoire of possibilities is also trying to engage people in ways that perhaps they haven't been before, or engage parts of them that haven't been engaged with that specific issue. There's this quote that I love that I'm hearing more and more around from Tony K. Bambara, which is that the role of artists is to make the revolution irresistible. And for me, that's like, yes, that's exactly right. And that plays into these possibilities for me. It's like making it irresistible and then offering someone something that then they want to lean onto. And the last thing maybe that I would say around principles that I like to keep in mind as a creative and as a comms person is the idea of framing. There's a lot of literature out there around framing that I'd really recommend people to look into if they haven't yet. Anyone who's trying to make change and communicate things to people, I think needs to look into framing, because otherwise we run the risk of actually undermining the things that we are trying to work on. If we are, for example, framing an action in a way that actually reinforces the kind of values that wouldn't be useful in the kinds of societies we're trying to create. And those who don't want us to change in that way would actually be grateful that we're doing their job for them. So it's an interesting thing that I think definitely people should look into if they haven't yet.
I love that quote, make the revolution irresistible. And I think it truly points back to our earlier discussion about, am I doing enough? There are lots and lots of people that have focused on the data and science and facts that are still debated about climate change and the impending crisis and what we can do about it and how long we have. And that is absolutely important. And in addition to that, I think this skill set and view of engaging people with their hearts and minds rather than just their brains all the time is an incredible kind of dimension to this conversation that I'm so glad you're sharing. So I think in this line of work, everybody goes through a roller coaster experience. There's ups and downs in terms of sometimes, small steps of progress that we feel like we're making, and then sometimes big setbacks depending on administration changing, leadership changing, regulation rollback, etc. Where do you derive hope to keep going in your line of work?
Yes. So I I've been listening to Mariana Hegler a lot, and she doesn't like the idea of hope or the question of hope. She doesn't think that it's very useful in this moment, and that has resonated with me in some ways, in terms of sometimes encountering hope being used as an excuse for not doing what needs to be done.
Yes.
It's sort of like a delay of responsibility, but at least that's how I understand it. It's like things are already really, really bad, and maybe holding on to hope means that you don't, I don't know, that it's an external thing again, that you're relying on for the change to happen, when actually we all need to do stuff in order for change to happen. We can't just be relying on this thing outside. But having said that, at the same time, I do find hope to nourish me and keep me going. And actually, one of the major sources of hope for me is the communities that I organize with. Every time that I have a meeting with the collectives that I'm part of, and I'm really lucky to be part of a wonderful collective called Wretched of the Earth, and every time that I'm in a meeting with them, I feel hope in being with these wonderful people who have dedicated so much of their lives to creating change in ways that are that go above and beyond what is expected from them or what society tells them they should be doing. For me, this incredible capacity of human beings to want good for one another and to wish well to one another and to actually work on trying to make the conditions for others to flourish, to bring them about. I think that really gives me hope. And at the same time, I have also had to do some active work on focusing on joy as well. And that's why that's one of my main principles in liberation works, because it's very easy when you're working in this field and you're exposed to so much suffering and this, such horrendous things happening in the world, and you feel powerless and you feel like, oh, what can I do about all of these things? And then you work really hard because you want to make a difference, and then you forget about joy. Then that's also not good, because there are so many things that are wonderful about this world at the same time, and as I said, so many wonderful things about human beings, that it is important to remember. It's important to attend to that and to find delight in that. So I think, going back to the point about being active, so instead of being hopeful and just staying like, oh, being active in the search of joy and in the search of delight, I think is also super important. And the other thing that I would say is there's also something around faith that I'm feeling more and more comfortable talking about. I didn't used to, which I think is also something that I hold on to, and courageous faith, because I don't take it for granted. I think it is really powerful when people have faith. And I feel like as a movement, at least here in the UK, I think in the US it may be a bit more open, but here in the UK there's a bit of a resistance to spirituality and faith within activist circles. And for me, I feel it's useful to try and break that apart as well, and try and, at least how I see it, recognize that something that is so present in activist communities and in organizing communities and in people trying to make change is the belief in something better.
Right.
And that is faith. So for me, that's one of the main, the main things that I do hold on to, this belief that we can be better together. And the fact that so many people want it is proof of that.
Absolutely. And wow, I love how balanced that is and nuanced in terms of not necessarily rejecting hope, but replacing it with courage to take action and being open and accepting of where you derive joy, whether that's from your faith, if it's religious, or maybe it's more secular and it's faith, like you said, in a better future collectively when people are able to take that action rather than waiting around for it to happen. So that's wonderful insight, and I think very useful in contending with the demands of doing work in climate action and climate justice. So we promised our listeners the number one thing that they could do to make a positive impact. I'm curious what your advice here is for people who are eager to combat climate change and kind of the systemic challenges that we face to do so.
Yes, the one thing. So when I was doing my master's, one of the modules was around toolkits, and we were asked to create a toolkit for change, or for people to engage in change. And the thing that I did, I should have done it on my hand, was I invited people to draw a question mark on their hand.
Cool.
And then you go around life, and everything that you touch, basically, you have a question mark in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole point was question, 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 question. There's this one quote that is my absolute favorite quote. One of my favorite quotes. I have lots of favorite quotes. One of my favorite quotes by Virginia Woolf, which is, "Let us never cease from thinking, what is this civilization in which we find ourselves? What are these ceremonies and why should we take part in them? What are these professions and why should we make money out of them? Where in short is it leading us? The procession of the sons of educated men." And for me, that when I read that, I was like, yes, this is the thing. This idea of what is it? What is this civilization in which we find ourselves? That's something that is ever present for me. And that's what that question mark was about. And I think it is important that we don't take the status quo for granted, that we don't fall into that trap of thinking this is how things need to be because this is how they are. This system that we're living in was created by people like us. So it can be changed as well. I think, it's just one small thing that you can do. But yeah, the other side of it is also recognizing that, yes, as individuals, we can do stuff, and that is very important. And doing that work is where we need to start from. But at the same time, doing stuff collectively is where big change can actually happen. So joining with others and doing things in community is also something that I would recommend.
I love that call to action. I don't think I'll ever look at my hand the same way again. So it's a very cool visual reminder to question what's right in front of you, to question the institutions and infrastructure societally that have been around for centuries, maybe even thousands of years, that we all just take for granted. And I think your last point about it's not just about what you can do as an individual. Yes, there are lots of things that you can take on yourself, especially to turn hope into courage. But to your point about what is it that we need our communities and our institutions and our governments, what's your expectation for them to mobilize around climate justice?
Yes. I think, so I'd say the moment that we are living in right now, as we are recording this, with the COVID-19 pandemic, doing what it's doing all over the world, for me, that is a tragedy. that is a result of the system that we're living in. Mm-hmm. And one of my expectations and one of my hopes is that we realize that as communities, that we realize actually this system has been failing us, has been failing the most vulnerable in societies, and when governments want it, they can find the money to do all sorts of things. And actually, governments can't operate without people. They need us in order, they need it. This pandemic has shown the value of care work and the value of so much work that is not recognized. And I think communities recognizing their power, communities recognizing actually how important they are, how important we are as people, how important we are as collectives, and that we could be living under a completely different system if that's what the people who have the money would want to. So I think, my expectation is that we can come together and demand that we can demand nothing less but justice. Because it can, this moment has shown that things can be different. It's just that those who are benefiting from the status quo don't want it to. But I think, so there's this other great, the person that I admire called Angel Kyoto Williams, and she talks about this idea, this notion that we are reaching a tipping point when the willingness to be in denial is dying in people. And she says that the moment that there's enough of us who are at that stage, then things will need to change. And it feels to me like this moment is approaching. Like it feels to me like right now, with the situation that we're living in, it is really hard to be in denial, or at least that's how I feel. Like it's really hard to not see how messed up the structures that we're living under are, and how uncivilized civilization is. And also to hopefully wake up to the possibilities of change, and to realize actually that we need a different system if we do want everyone to be able to flourish, and that we're all interconnected, and all of our lives are dependent on one another so much, even though sometimes we are in denial about that, and we think that we are individuals and we have agency and power to control our lives, but we are not. It's not like that. We're interconnected, interdependent, and together we can create something else.
Absolutely. And for our viewers, I think it's awesome to point out that the painting behind you was created during your first shelter-in-place week, self-quarantining. And so, a lot of beauty and joy and pause to reflect on what is the situation we're in, back to your advice about questioning everything, and maybe taking the COVID-19 pandemic as, if we have the privilege to, a reminder to practice perspective and to look at what's in place and what is now being rallied around to find resources, to find economic support, to support healthcare workers, and also to really see society for what it is and what it has become, and to question whether that's what we want. And then importantly, to apply that to what about the climate justice space in terms of, trying to fight climate change and how we want to do that more equitably. So a lot of really wonderful nuggets in there about your expectation for what we can do as individuals and also as communities. So we're coming up towards the end of our interview, and I'm curious, my last question is about, as you look across your career, what has been your favorite aha moment? You've already shared so many wonderful epiphanies, and I think, actual advice for people. So if you had to pick one, what would that be?
So I think it relates to one of the things I was talking about at the beginning, around this imposter syndrome and trying to be enough and all of that. That being in that space, that frame of mind, and being almost like scared to show too much of myself, out of fear of making a mistake, and being like, oh, I don't want to make a grammatical mistake, or I don't want to, like, I don't know, put myself out there too much. So the tendency to do that, I think, led to me having like my guard up and being quite rigid and quite miserable, I think, in terms of my relationships, work relationships. And I think one of the aha moments for me was being like, realizing that I was at a point in my career where I didn't really need to do that anymore, or I was in a point also in my personal development where I didn't need to do that. And I want to say that I do think those instincts are useful, and I think, you know, I was new to this country and all of those things, so it is important to also look after yourself, and if that's what you think that you need to be doing in that moment, and you need to put a barrier up, and you need to keep a bit of a distance, then that's absolutely legitimate and, you know, survival skill. So I think I was doing the right thing at the time, but it was an aha moment to realize, like, oh, maybe I don't need to do that anymore. Maybe I'm at a point where I am more comfortable being who I am and making mistakes and owning them if I do make them, and allowing myself to show myself more, be more authentic, be more vulnerable, be more jokey or informal, and in doing that, realizing how much I was craving it and how much I was tired of being this person that I had become in order to protect myself, and that actually was time to just let that go a little bit. And it doesn't mean that it was like probably actually for other people they didn't notice the change that much, but for me it made a huge difference. It was like a release, like, oh, okay, I've arrived, and you know, I'm comfortable. And then that actually has, I think, led to more authentic relationships, more compassionate relationships, and more understanding with other people, which is something that for me is crucial for the line of work that I do. I want to be able to communicate with others and really understand where they're coming from, even if it may be different from where I'm coming from, in order for us to go somewhere together.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for being vulnerable in sharing this story and your experience, which truly resonates with me. I think people of color, women in the societies that we work in, it is tough to go in feeling like you will be fully accepted for all the different dimensions of your personality right off the bat. And so I went through a similar experience, and it took years to be able to say, this is who I am, and to realize, like you said, that actually is what makes you great at what you do, and it allows you to be who you are authentically and go back to your very first point about being authentic to your values and finding that intersection with the work that's meaningful for you. So it's incredible to hear, and I love the name of your company, Liberation Works, for that reason, because it does feel like a release and an ability to bring your full self to this important work that we're doing. So thank you so much, Marcela, for all the insight, the really wonderful kind of path that you've taken, which I know resonates with me, with so many of our listeners, especially those creatives out there and other people that are kind of battling with imposter syndrome. I think your nuggets of wisdom will really help them.
Thank you so much for having me and for this really, really nice chat.